And I've auditioned for a lot and haven't got a lot. And then Gran Torino came around where he was talking to me. It was like this little role.
Clint Eastwood has always been the symbol of Hollywood toughness. A man whose squint alone could silence an entire room and whose name carried a legacy of grit, discipline, and mystery. But what if I told you that behind the rugged cowboy image, behind the world-famous director's chair, there's a story that even his most loyal fans never saw coming. A story tied not to Clint himself, but to his son, Scott Eastwood. You see, when the world first learned Clint had a son walking in his footsteps, people thought it would be simple. A father passes the torch to his child, and the legacy continues. But the reality was far more complicated, filled with moments of distance, heartbreak, and secrets that the world is only beginning to uncover. From the very beginning, Scott's life was shaped not by fame and comfort, but by absence and questions. For years, many didn't even know Clint Eastwood was his father, and Scott himself grew up with a strange gap in his life. A father who was both larger than life and yet, at times, not there at all. Imagine being a child and hearing whispers about your father being a Hollywood icon, but not having him around to tuck you into bed, not having him guide you through the simple milestones of life. That emptiness stayed with Scott, carving a silence that would one day shape the man he became. But as Scott grew older, the silence gave way to determination. Instead of letting the shadow of his father's fame crush him, he chose to step directly into it, testing himself against impossible odds. Yet every step came with whispers, comparisons, and doubts. Was he really talented? Or was he just Clint Eastwood's son? And while he tried to prove himself on screen, there were other, deeper battles happening away from the cameras. Tragedies, heartbreaks, and the scars of being connected to a man whose fame was both a blessing and a curse. But what no one knew was that Scott carried a pain far heavier than the pressure of Hollywood. A pain rooted in family, love, and loss that nearly broke him before he could truly rise. And it all started with a truth that Clint Eastwood himself kept hidden for years. A truth that would come to light only when Scott was old enough to face the reality of his father's world. The hidden truth about Clint Eastwood's family life was something the media never fully understood, because Clint himself was a man who thrived on mystery. He was admired for his films, for his rugged independence, but when it came to his personal life, he built walls higher than anyone could climb. And behind those walls was Scott, a young boy growing up with questions that no one around him seemed willing to answer. Clint had multiple relationships, children from different women, and a complicated personal history that few could keep track of. For Scott, this meant that his father was more of a myth than a presence, a figure he would sometimes see but never truly know. Imagine the confusion of growing up, knowing your father was one of the most famous men in the world, yet not being able to call him the way other children called their dads, not being able to feel that constant connection. It was a strange kind of loneliness, because how do you explain to people that your father is everywhere on magazine covers, but almost nowhere in your daily life? This emotional gap created a tension that shaped Scott's youth. While other kids could rely on their fathers for guidance, Scott had to rely on his own resilience. And the cruel part was that people around him always expected him to be privileged, to live an easy life, simply because of his father's name. They didn't see the battles he was fighting on the inside. They didn't understand the silence he carried with him. That silence would follow him into his teenage years, where the need for identity and belonging became even stronger. But instead of breaking down, Scott found himself building a kind of armor, much like the roles his father played on screen: tough, determined, unwilling to let pain show. Yet behind that armor, the truth was raw. Clint's absence had left scars, and those scars pushed Scott to search for meaning in ways that sometimes led him into reckless choices. Friends from his youth recall moments where Scott seemed restless, like a young man constantly trying to prove himself, as if the shadow of his father's fame was both haunting him and pushing him forward. And then came the inevitable moment when the media began to connect the dots, when whispers turned into headlines, when people discovered that Clint Eastwood had another son, one who was trying to find his own place in the world. For Scott, this revelation was both freeing and frightening. On one hand, the truth was finally out, but on the other hand, it meant the weight of expectation had doubled. Now the world was watching, judging, and waiting to see if Clint's son could ever live up to the Eastwood name. As the world began to recognize Scott Eastwood as Clint Eastwood's son, the attention was not always the blessing people imagined. It was a burden wrapped in fame. Every time Scott auditioned for a role, every time he stepped in front of a camera, there was an unspoken question hanging in the air. Was he there because of talent, or because of his father's shadow? Hollywood is unforgiving, and nepotism is a word thrown around with sharp edges. And Scott quickly realized that carrying the Eastwood name was a double-edged sword. Yes, doors opened, but once inside, he had to fight twice as hard to prove he belonged. Casting directors compared him to Clint. Journalists measured his every gesture against the legendary image of his father, and audiences expected him to instantly possess the same magnetic presence. But Scott was not Clint. He was his own man, and carving out that individuality was a painful process. There were times when the rejection cut deep, when roles slipped away because producers didn't want another Eastwood unless he could be exactly like the original. And there were times when the criticism felt endless, as if people were waiting for him to fail. Still, Scott carried himself with quiet resilience. What the public didn't see was how much of this drive came from his complicated relationship with Clint himself. For years, Scott longed for his father's approval, not as an actor, but as a son. He wanted Clint to see him, to truly acknowledge the effort, the struggle, the pain behind the smile. But Clint Eastwood was a man who expressed emotions in silence, who built a life on stoicism and restraint, and that left Scott constantly wondering if he was ever enough. And then, life dealt Scott a blow that no career challenge could compare to. In 2014, his girlfriend was killed in a tragic car accident, a heartbreak so sudden and devastating that it shattered him in ways fame never could. The loss was unbearable, and Scott later admitted that it haunted him, that it broke his spirit and left him questioning everything. In those moments of grief, he was not Clint Eastwood's son, not a rising actor, but simply a young man drowning in pain. And yet, even in the darkest nights, he found himself turning to the lessons he had quietly absorbed from his father, the ability to endure, to keep moving, to never let life's tragedies erase the will to fight. It was this resilience, born of both distance and longing, that began to shape Scott into more than just a man chasing a legacy. It shaped him into someone who could survive heartbreak, rejection, and pressure, and still stand tall in front of the world. But what came next would test not just his strength, but his identity. Scott's journey through grief and expectation didn't just harden him, it reshaped him. After the devastating loss of his girlfriend, Scott poured himself into his work with a raw determination that surprised even those closest to him. He began taking roles that demanded grit and vulnerability, characters that, in a way, mirrored his own inner struggles. Movies like The Longest Ride and Suicide Squad gave him visibility, but they also forced him into a constant tug-of-war with the ghost of Clint Eastwood's legacy. Every red carpet, every interview, every box office performance carried a silent comparison. Was Scott finally proving he could stand on his own? Or was he forever destined to be known as Clint's son? For many, it was impossible to separate the two. And that was the irony. Scott never asked for the Eastwood name to define him, but the world refused to see him without it. Behind the scenes, though, something more complicated was unfolding between father and son. Clint, now older and more reflective, began to show glimpses of pride, but in his own quiet way. He wasn't a man of flowery speeches or emotional declarations, but Scott noticed the subtle shifts: an approving nod on set, a rare word of encouragement, or simply the acknowledgement that he was doing well. For Scott, these small gestures meant more than awards or fame. They were the beginnings of a connection he had craved his whole life. Yet even as this bond slowly grew, the public's fascination with their relationship only intensified. Tabloids speculated about their closeness, about Clint's role in Scott's life, about the secrets still hidden in the Eastwood family tree. After all, Clint had fathered 8 children with different women, and the question of favoritism, absence, and hidden truths was something that never stopped fueling rumors. Scott found himself caught in a paradox. He wanted to be seen as his own man, yet he couldn't escape the gravitational pull of his father's mysterious legacy. And the more he tried to step away from it, the more the world pulled him back. Friends say that Scott often wrestled with this duality. On one hand, he admired Clint's greatness. On the other, he resented the burden it placed on his shoulders. But perhaps the most haunting question remained unanswered. Did Clint ever regret the distance, the years lost, the moments he could never give back to his son? No one knows for sure, and Clint himself has rarely spoken openly about it. What we do know is that Scott's path, filled with tragedy, resilience, and relentless effort, was never a smooth inheritance of fame. It was a battlefield where he had to fight for his own name, even as the world insisted on tying it to his father's. And just when Scott began to find his footing, life would once again throw him into a test that went beyond Hollywood and touched the very core of who he was becoming. In the end, the story of Scott Eastwood is not just about being Clint Eastwood's son. It is about a man who refused to let another person's shadow define the light he carried inside himself. Over the years, Scott has embraced the hardships, the heartbreaks, and the weight of expectation, and he has transformed them into fuel for his journey. He speaks openly now about the lessons pain has taught him, about the importance of resilience, and about how loss, though unbearable, can shape a person into someone stronger. What makes his journey so moving is that it mirrors the struggles of many who live in the shadows of giants. Whether those giants are famous parents, impossible expectations, or the scars of personal tragedy. Scott's courage lies in the fact that he never denied the weight of being Clint Eastwood's son. But he never surrendered to it either. He chose instead to build his own identity brick by brick, roll by roll, moment by moment, until people began to see him not as an extension of Clint, but as Scott himself. And yet, the mystery of Clint Eastwood still lingers over the story. Did father and son ever truly bridge the gap? Did Clint ever sit down and tell Scott he was proud in the way Scott had always longed to hear? We may never know because Clint remains as enigmatic as ever, but perhaps the answer lies not in what Clint said, but in what Scott became. The resilience, the quiet strength, the refusal to give up, all of it is proof that he inherited not just a name, but a spirit. And maybe that was Clint's way of passing the torch, not through words, but through the silent lessons of endurance and survival. Today, Scott continues to rise in Hollywood, but more importantly, he continues to rise in life. He has turned his pain into wisdom, his struggles into strength, and his longing into purpose. His journey is still unfolding, but one thing is clear. He is no longer just Clint Eastwood's son. He is a man who has lived through storms, carried invisible scars, and yet walks forward with unshakable determination. And perhaps that is the ultimate truth hidden beneath the Eastwood legend. Behind the fame, behind the silence, behind the mystery, lies a father and a son whose story is not about perfection, but about the fragile, complicated, and deeply human struggle to connect, to heal, and to be seen. For the world, Clint Eastwood will always be the cowboy, the legend, the icon. But for Scott, he will always be the absent presence that both haunted him and shaped him, the man he spent years trying to understand, and the man whose shadow he finally learned to step out of. And maybe that is where the real power of this story lies. Not in the fame, not in the scandals, not in the legacy, but in the universal truth that no matter who your parents are, your real story begins the moment you decide to write your own.